A mine entry in Scranton. Winter. She was 8 years old, holding her father's coat hem while he crouched at a crack in the rock wall and held a candle near the stone. The flame bent sideways, pulled by something moving inside the fracture. Coal dust smelled metallic in the cold. He tapped the wall and said, "Stone breathes before men know it does." 20 years later, standing on a frozen claim with 2 children and no way out, she felt warm air rising from a hole in the ground where her sheep kept disappearing, and her father's voice came back like an instruction she had not yet earned. Miriam Tazewell Voss arrived on the upper claim in late October of 1886, with everything she owned loaded into a borrowed freight wagon. 11 ewes, 1 ram, a milk goat tied to the tailgate, a cracked Franklin stove, 2 quilts patched with flour sacking, 1 copper kettle black with soot, a child's bed frame missing a slat, and $21.40 folded inside a hymnal. Nell sat on the bed frame holding Owen against the wind. Owen was 6 and had not spoken since his father's funeral. Asa Voss had died 3 weeks earlier. The wagon carrying lime from the kilns near Glenwood had lost a wheel on a grade above the Grand River, and the load shifted and pinned him against a boulder before anyone could lever it free. He lived 4 hours, long enough to ask for water, to say Miriam's name twice, and to tell the man holding his hand that the debt note at Fane's store covered everything through December. Then the blood in his chest found its way out, and Asa Voss was 36 years old and finished. The debt note was the thing that mattered now. Carver Fane held it, $47 for supplies advanced through summer on the promise of wool and labor. Asa had signed it in April when the ewes were heavy and the valley lease looked sound. By October, Asa was in the ground, and the valley lease was worth more than the debt. Fane knew it. He had known it before the lime wagon left the kilns. His offer came wrapped in patience. He called it mercy. If Miriam signed over Asa's valley lease, the good grass, the creek frontage, the sheltered draw where cattle could winter, Fane would forgive the debt note and let her take the upper claim instead. The upper claim was 160 acres of basalt bench, scrub oak, shallow soil, and wind. No one had filed on it because no one wanted it. Fane wanted it now only because he wanted everything adjacent to the valley, and because he had heard talk of mineral water somewhere in the rock above the river corridor. But the claim itself, as a place to live, was a punishment dressed as a gift. Miriam signed because the alternatives were worse. She had no fare east. Her nearest brother lived in Scranton, 500 miles and 2 train changes away, and his last letter said the mines were cutting shifts. She had no legal husband to front negotiations, no savings beyond the $21, and no claim on Asa's valley lease without the means to work it. A widow with 2 children and a flock of 11 sheep did not negotiate with the man who held her debt. She took what was offered and loaded the wagon before Fane could add conditions. The freight driver, a man named Crutchfield who hauled between Glenwood and the mining camps, helped her unload without being asked and without saying much. He set the stove on flat ground near the cabin wall, stacked the bed frame pieces beside it, and tied the goat to a juniper post. When he finished, he looked at the cabin and then at the children, and then at the sky, which was the color of old iron and moving fast from the northwest. He asked who was coming with the rest of her things. Miriam said there were no other things. Crutchfield drove out before dark. The wagon sound faded into sage and wind, and then there was nothing but the claim. Sakartin Sarser. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet, built by a prospector who had quit the bench 2 seasons earlier. The walls were rough-cut pine, half chinked with mud and grass that had dried and crumbled until daylight showed through in 6 places Miriam could count from inside. The roof was plank, not shake, laid flat with no pitch worth mentioning, which meant snow would sit on it until the weight cracked something. The door hung on leather hinges and did not meet the frame on the latch side. A gap wide enough to fit 3 fingers ran along the bottom where the sill log had warped. Miriam set the stove inside and fitted the pipe through a hole already cut in the roof. The pipe did not seat flush. Smoke would leak at the joint when the wind pushed down. She stuffed the gap with a rag torn from Owen's outgrown shirt and knew it would char through before December. The wood situation was the first thing that would kill them if she counted wrong. Against the north wall of the cabin, the previous occupant had left less than 1 cord of pine, dry, light, and fast-burning. Miriam had learned fuel math from her father in the Pennsylvania coal patch. A tight cabin with a good stove in moderate cold burned a 1/4 cord per week. But this cabin was not tight. The stove was cracked along one plate, and the cold here was not moderate. 5 cords would see them through March if the winter held to pattern. 7 if it broke bad. She had one. The sheep were the second calculation. 11 ewes and a ram needed forage. In open winter with accessible grass, they could graze rough. But if snow crusted over or drifted deep, and in this country above 7,000 feet, it would, they needed hay. Miriam figured 3 tons to carry the flock through to spring grass. She had brought 900 pounds of poor meadow hay purchased on the last of Ace's credit, plus 1 sack of oats that weighed maybe 40 pounds. 900 pounds against 6,000 needed. The gap was not a gap, it was a canyon. She could supplement with willow browse if the creek bottom stayed open. She could turn the sheep onto south-facing slopes where wind sometimes kept grass bare. But those were gambits, not plans, and they depended on weather she could not control and terrain she did not yet know. $21.40. That was the third number. Nails cost 12 cents a pound. Rope cost 20 cents a length. Hey, if anyone had surplus to sell ran $4 a ton in a good year and twice that when snow came early. Her $21 was not a budget. It was a countdown. Nell helped her unpack in silence. The girl was 9 and had her father's square hands and her mother's habit of counting things without being asked. She stacked the 2 quilts on the bed frame, set the copper kettle by the stove, and arranged the food stores on a plank shelf without being told. A half sack of cornmeal, a tin of lard, dried beans in a cloth bag, salt in a jar with a cracked lid, and 6 potatoes already showing eyes. Nell looked at the shelf when she finished. She did not say it was not enough. She did not need to. Owen sat on the bed frame and watched the smoke leak from the stovepipe joint. He had not spoken since the funeral, and Miriam did not push him. Grief in a 6-year-old boy does not answer to instruction. It answers to time and to warmth and to the feeling that the ground beneath him has stopped moving. Miriam could not yet promise him any of those things. That night, with the sheep penned against the cabin wall in a brush corral that would not survive serious wind, Miriam lay on the floor beside the children's bed and listened to the stove tick as it cooled. The fire she had built was already half consumed. At this rate, the cord would last 3 weeks, maybe less. She closed her eyes and saw the numbers. 1 cord, 900 pounds of hay, $21, 2 children, 11 sheep, 160 acres of rock, 5 months of winter, and no one coming. Anson Peel arrived on the 3rd morning. He came on a dun horse with a county road survey map rolled under his arm, though Miriam suspected the map was an excuse and the visit was curiosity dressed as duty. Peel was 62, former trail boss on the Goodnight Loving route, now county road overseer, and the nearest thing the upper bench had to an authority on who could survive there and who could not. He had shoulders that looked carved from the same basalt as the claim, a voice like gravel dragged over plank, and an opinion on everything that moved or tried to stand still in his jurisdiction. He did not dismount immediately. He sat the horse and looked at the cabin, the brush corral, the sheep huddled against wind, the children's wash hanging on a rope between two junipers, and the pile of wood that was visibly insufficient. Then he swung down and walked the property line like a man pricing damage. Miriam met him at the cabin door. She did not invite him inside because the inside was worse than the outside, and she knew it. Peel spoke without greeting. "You have half a cabin. The chinking is gone on the north wall, and the roof will sag under 2 feet of wet snow. You have maybe 1 cord of wood. You need 5 minimum, and that is if the stove holds, which it will not because the plate is cracked and you are losing heat through the fracture." He pointed at the brush corral. "That pen will not stop a determined coyote. It will certainly not stop wind. Your hay pile is short by 2/3, and your grazing is rock and sage above the browse line." He paused and looked at Nell, who was watching from the side of the cabin with Owen behind her. "Sheep do not winter on hope, Mrs. Voss. Neither do children." Miriam waited until he was finished. She had learned from her father that men who talk long expect silence as an answer, and silence unnerves them more than argument. Peel shifted his weight. "I'm telling you this because Asa was a decent man, and you deserve honesty instead of watching. Sell the sheep to Greer before first snow. He will give you $3 a head for the ewes, maybe 4 for the ram. Board the children with the Hockett family until spring. Take washing in Glenwood. You can earn enough by April to file on something better, or to go east." "And the claim?" Miriam asked. Peel looked at the ground. "Fane will argue the debt note covers it if you abandon. You would need a lawyer, and lawyers cost more than sheep." "Then I cannot sell the sheep," Miriam said. "The sheep are the only thing I own that makes more of itself. Sell them, and I have $33 and no spring. Keep them, and I have lambs in March and wool in May." "You have lambs in March if the ewes survive January," Peel said. "And they will not survive January in that pen with that hay." "Then I need to find another way to keep them warm." Peel looked at her the way men look at women who have said something that confirms what they feared. Not anger, something closer to resignation. "Mrs. Voss, I have wintered stock in this country for 20 years. There's no trick to it. There is wood and hay and walls and luck, and you are short on all 4. He mounted and rode out. At the property edge, he turned in the saddle and said one more thing. "A warm grave is still a grave." Miriam stood in the wind and watched him go. His words settled into her like stones into a creek bed. She did not dismiss them. Peel was not wrong about the math. He was wrong about the options. She went back inside and fed the stove another split of pine. The woodpile shrank by 1 piece. The countdown continued. The sheep solved the first puzzle before Miriam did. On the 9th night, a frost came down, hard enough to split the water in the goat's pail. The temperature had been falling for 3 days, each morning worse than the one before, and by dusk the air had the kind of stillness that means the cold is not passing through but settling in. Miriam banked the stove, piled both quilts on the children, and went out at midnight to check the flock. 3 ewes were gone. She counted twice. The brush corral was intact. No break, no drag marks, no blood on snow, no coyote tracks. The remaining 8 sheep stood pressed together against the cabin wall, breathing clouds that froze on their wool before drifting away. The ram stood apart, facing the dark slope below the corral, ears forward. Miriam took the lantern and followed the slope. The ground was frozen hard enough to ring under her boots, and the sage crackled when she pushed through it. She expected the worst. 3 ewes dead in a draw, killed by something she had not heard. But there was no blood, no wool caught on rock or thorn. Only hoof scrapes in the frost, leading downhill toward a thicket of chokecherry that grew in a crease between two basalt outcrops, and warm air. She felt it before she understood it. A breath of damp warmth rising through the thorn branches, strong enough to melt frost on the nearest stems and leave them dark and wet while everything around them was white. The air smelled of minerals, not sulfur exactly, but something close. Something that reminded her of the hot spring bathhouse in Glenwood where Asa had taken her once, when they had first arrived and the country still felt like a choice rather than a sentence. She pushed into the thicket. Behind the chokecherry, a sinkhole opened in the rock, a jagged vertical slot, maybe 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, partially screened by brush and loose stone. Warm air pulsed from it like breath from a sleeping animal. At dawn, the 3 missing ewes pushed back out of the brush. They were dry. They were warm. Their wool smelled faintly of minerals, and the led ewe had a burr of chokecherry bark caught in her fleece. They had spent the night somewhere below the frost, somewhere the cold could not reach them. Miriam said nothing to the children. She watched. The next night, 5 ewes vanished. Nell woke at first light and said, "Mama, the bells are under the ground." She was right. The faint sound of sheep bells came not from the slope, but from below it, muffled and resonant, like sound traveling through stone. Miriam tied a strip of red flannel around the lead ew's neck and waited downwind at dusk. She watched the flock nose along the base of the corral, find the gap where brush met rock, and follow the warm air like a scent trail. The lead ewe squeezed into the chokecherry thicket without hesitation. The others followed. The red flannel disappeared into the dark slot. Her father's voice came back to her then, not as memory, but as instruction. A mine entry in Scranton, winter of 1870. She was 8 years old, holding his coat hem while he crouched at a crack in the mine wall and held a candle near the rock. The flame bent sideways, pulled by air moving through the fracture. "Stone breathes before men know it does," he had said. "Warm air rises, cold air falls. If you feel warm breath from rock in winter, there is a cavity below, and the earth is heating it." He had tapped the wall. "Coal mines have their own weather. You learn to read it, or you die in it." Miriam went back to the sinkhole at midday. The warm breath was still there, steady, unchanged by the surface temperature. She lowered a lantern on a rope, letting it drop slowly into the slot. The flame did not die. It did not gutter or blew at the edges, which would mean bad air pooling at floor level. It leaned inward, drawn by the same current that moved the warm breath upward. She measured the rope. 11 feet to a place where the rock widened. She rigged a second rope around the base of a scrub oak, tied knots every foot for grip, and tested it with her full weight. Then she wrapped her skirt tight, tucked it into her belt, took the lantern in one hand, and lowered herself into the earth. The first drop was narrow enough to scrape both shoulders. Loose stone shifted under her boots. She descended by feel, counting knots. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the walls fell away and her feet found a sloping surface that angled down rather than dropping. The lantern threw yellow light across a throat of rock that widened as she followed it, stepping carefully where water had smoothed the floor. Then the throat opened. The cavern was larger than anything she had imagined. Rough stone walls arched into darkness above her, and the lantern light did not reach the far end. She paced it later, 180 feet long, 60 to 70 feet wide at the broadest, with a ceiling that varied from 8 feet to maybe 20, where the rock domed upward. A spring pool steamed from a stone basin near the center, the water too hot to hold her hand in at the source, but cooling as it spread across the rock. The air was humid enough to bead on her hair and warm enough to make her shiver, not from cold, but from the shock of warmth after weeks of freezing. Above the pool, a dry ledge ran along the eastern wall. On it, she found sheep droppings, wool caught on jagged stone, hoof-polished rock where animals had lain. The sheep had been using this place long before she found it, maybe before anyone found it. The warmest spot in a claim no one wanted, hidden under brush and rock, and the assumption that nothing of value grew on the upper bench. She sat on the ledge and held the lantern up. The flame burned steady and clean. The air moved. She could feel it on her face, a slow draft pulling from the entrance towards some crack or vent she could not see. Moving air meant the cave breathed. Breathable air meant it could be occupied. Miriam climbed back up into the cold. The wind hit her face like a punishment. She looked at the cabin with its leaking roof and cracked stove and 3-week wood supply, and then she looked at the sinkhole with its breath of warm, damp air, and the calculation changed. Louisa Hockett came to check on the children 3 days later and found Miriam drawing on the back of a flour sack with a charcoal stub. Louisa was 29, raw-boned, practical, and married to a man named Dill Hockett, who was away cutting railroad ties near Aspen and would not be back until the snow trapped him somewhere he could not cut. She had a toddler of her own, a sod-roofed cabin a mile downslope, and the particular kind of competence that frontier women develop when their husbands are present only in theory. She was not cruel, she was not dismissive, she was the most dangerous kind of skeptic, the one who is right about the risks. Miriam told her about the cave. She had to tell someone. The plan taking shape on the flour sack was too large to hold alone, and Louisa was the only person within walking distance who would listen without calculating what the information was worth. Louisa listened. She asked how deep. She asked how wide. She asked about the water temperature and the air quality and the sheep's behavior. She asked good questions, and Miriam answered them with the specifics she had measured. 11-foot entrance drop, 180-foot chamber, water too hot at the source but cooling on the rock, air moving steadily, flame holding clean, sheep choosing it over the surface. Then Louisa said the thing Miriam had already thought but not spoken. Warm air rots lungs if it cannot leave. I've seen children sick from root cellars that were sealed too tight in spring. Damp takes children faster than cold. The air moves, Miriam said. There is a draft. A draft in October, Louisa said. What about February, when ice seals every crack? You do not know what that cave does under 3 feet of snow. You do not know if the air turns bad at depth. You do not know if the rock is stable. She looked at the flour sack, at the rough lines Miriam had drawn showing a ramp, a platform, a drainage channel. And you're talking about moving sheep underground. A panicked sheep in a hole will break its own legs before it lets you help it. The sheep go voluntarily, Miriam said. They have been choosing it for nights. Sheep choose it because they are warm. Children do not choose what warms them. You choose for them. And if you choose wrong, they suffocate in a warm hole and no one finds them until spring. Louisa's objection sat in the cabin between them like a third person. It was not wrong. Damp air, sealed spaces, mineral fumes, rockfall. These were real dangers, not invented ones. Miriam's father had lost friends to bad air in mines. She knew what it looked like when the oxygen thinned, the candle guttering, the headache that arrives soft and leaves you on the floor, the blue at the base of the flame that means the air at ground level is no longer safe to breathe. But her father had also taught her the other side. Warm air rises. If the entrance stays open, cold air feeds the bottom, and warm air escapes the top, and the circulation keeps the space breathable. Animals find survivable air before humans trust their own judgment. Sheep will not lie down in air that is killing them. They will press toward the exit and bleat until they are heard, and rock temperature changes more slowly than surface weather. A cave that holds 78 degrees in October will hold close to that in January, because the mass of stone above it acts as a buffer that no wooden wall can match. The method forming in Miriam's mind was not living in a cave. It was something more specific, a managed shelter. Dry sleeping platforms raised above the damp floor, stone-lined drains to channel condensation away from the living areas, a ramp for the animals with side rails and resting shelves so they could descend without panic, a cold air baffle at the entrance, a canvas screen angled to slow the wind without sealing the draft, a ventilating shaft kept clear of brush and debris, and a rule absolute and unbreakable. No lantern burns below unless the test candle holds steady at every level. "I am not guessing," Miriam said. "My father worked mines for 20 years. He taught me air before he taught me letters. I know what moves and what sits. I know what kills." Louisa stood up and pulled her coat closed. "Your father worked mines," she said. "And mines collapse." She paused at the door. "I hope you are as right as you think you are, Miriam, because if you are wrong, I cannot dig you out." She left. The door swung on its leather hinges and did not close all the way. Cold air poured through the gap, and the stove ate another piece of the dwindling woodpile. Miriam looked at the flour sack. The drawing was rough, but the logic was sound. Ramp, platform, drain, baffle, vent, test. She folded the sack and put it inside the hymnal with the $21. Then she went out to measure the sinkhole again. The town found out before Miriam wanted it known. A boy named Wesley, 12 years old and sharp-eyed in the way that boys are when they have nothing to do but watch, saw Miriam at Fane's store buying rope, iron spikes, and 2 auger bits. She paid for the rope in cash, $3.10, and asked for the spikes and bits on credit. Fane wrote the amount in his ledger without looking up and said, loud enough for the men on the porch to hear, "That is $6.70 you owe now, Mrs. Voss. Do you mean to hang sheep or yourself?" Miriam did not answer. She gathered the supplies and walked out. But the question traveled faster than she did. By evening, 3 people had asked Louisa what the Voss widow was building, and Louisa, who was honest to a fault, said she did not know for certain, but it involved a hole in the ground. That was enough. Within 2 days, men at the hitching rail outside Fane's store called the sinkhole Voss's grave. A cattleman passing through said he had seen the widow dragging planks toward a pile of brush on the upper bench and suggested she was building stairs for sheep ghosts. 2 women from the lower settlement told their children they were not to visit Nell Voss anymore because the mother was unstable, and children who associate with instability become unpredictable themselves. Carver Fane invited the conversation. He stood behind his counter and said to anyone buying nails or flour that grief makes women foolish, and that someone ought to check on the Voss children before the county had to do it for reasons nobody wanted to name. He said it with concern in his voice and calculation in his eyes, because Fane understood something that the hitching rail gossips did not. Miriam was building something on a claim that Fane increasingly wanted to own. Fane was 44, Illinois-born, a storekeeper by trade and a speculator by instinct. He had come to the Roaring Fork Corridor in 1883 when the silver towns were spending and the railroad was laying grade. He had no interest in mining because mining required capital and risk. Retail required neither if you extended credit carefully and collected property when borrowers failed. He held debt notes on 4 families, owned 2 valley lots outright, and had an understanding with the county clerk that kept his filings ahead of anyone who might challenge them. The hot springs at Glenwood had already attracted investment, and the railroad had made mineral water valuable. Fane had heard talk, unconfirmed but persistent, that warm water surfaced somewhere on the upper bench. A widow with a debt note and no lawyer was not an obstacle. She was a convenience. His confrontation came wrapped in the same patience he had shown when offering the upper claim. He found Miriam loading rope onto a borrowed mule outside the store and stepped into her path. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I have been patient beyond what profit suggests. Asa's note is $47. You have paid $3.10 on rope that I suspect is not going toward anything that improves your ability to repay. The spikes and bits add $6.70. You owe me $50.60 now, and winter has not started." Miriam looked at him. Fane was taller than she was and wider, and he wore a vest with a watch chain that caught the light when he shifted, which he did frequently, as though reminding people that his time had a value they were consuming. "I will pay you in wool come May," Miriam said. "You will pay me in wool if the sheep are alive in May," Fane said. "And the sheep will not be alive in May if you are dragging them into holes instead of feeding them." He lowered his voice, which was worse than raising it. "Children do not belong in holes. If a man were alive in that cabin, he would say the same." Louisa had come to the store for salt and heard the last sentence. She stepped beside Miriam and said, "A man was alive in that cabin, Mr. Fane. You loaded his lime wagon yourself." Fane's mouth thinned. He looked at Louisa, then back at Miriam and said, "The debt note stands. I have shown patience. I will not show it forever." He went back inside. Miriam loaded the rope and the mule and walked the 2 miles back to the claim and wind that cut through her coat and found every gap in her clothing. Nell met her at the cabin with a tin cup of water heated on the stove. Owen stood behind his sister and watched the rope. "Mama," Nell said, "Mr. Peel came while you were gone. He said to tell you that if a child dies underground, the county will not call it misfortune." The social loss was now concrete. No shared labor, no borrowed team for hauling, no church basket at Christmas, no credit beyond what Fane grudgingly extended at rates that climbed with every purchase. The women who had refused to let their children visit Nell had spread the refusal to the school, and Nell was eating lunch alone when she went. Miriam stood in the doorway that night and watched the sheep nose toward the chokecherry thicket. 6 of them disappeared into the dark. The others stood in the cold, pressed together, choosing suffering they understood over warmth they could not see. She understood the sheep. She understood the neighbors. Fear of the unknown is not stupidity. It is experience compressed into refusal. Every person who doubted her had seen something go wrong underground, a mine, a cellar, a well. They were not wrong to be afraid. They were wrong to believe that fear was the same as knowledge. She checked the stove. The woodpile was down to 3/4 of a cord. At the current rate, she had 18 days. Maybe 20 if she burned less and froze more. The ramp frame was 1/3 sketched. The entrance still needed to be cleared without widening it enough to be seen from the road. The first beams had to be cut, hauled, and fitted before the ground froze too hard to work. And every day she spent building below was a day she was not cutting wood for the cabin, not hauling browse for the sheep, not earning the money she needed to keep Fane from calling the debt. The clock was not a clock. It was a rope stretching thinner with every choice. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see the risk but not the reason? She started at dawn. The first task was the entrance. Not widening it, but clearing the chokecherry away from the brush screen while leaving enough cover to hide the opening from anyone riding the road. The sinkhole's mouth was its only vulnerability. If Fane or anyone working for Fane discovered the warm air rising from the rock, the claim's value would change overnight, and a $50 debt note would become leverage for something much larger. Miriam cut the brush with a hand axe, stacking the branches in a loose screen that looked natural from a distance but allowed passage for a person or a sheep. She did not widen the rock mouth. The vertical slot was 3 feet by 5 feet, narrow enough to scrape her shoulders, too narrow for a large man to enter comfortably. That narrowness was a feature, not a flaw. The cave's defense was its entrance. The rope ladder came next. She used the rope purchased from Fane's store, knotted at 12-inch intervals, anchored around the scrub oak above the slot, and dropped into the dark. She tested it 20 times before letting Nell try, and Nell descended with the careful focus of a child who understands that the stakes are real and the parent is not pretending otherwise. But a rope ladder would not serve sheep, or Owen, or anyone carrying supplies. The real work was the ramp. Miriam sketched it on the flour sack 3 times before she found a design that fit the space. The vertical drop was 11 feet, but it was not a clean shaft. It angled slightly, with rock shoulders jutting from the walls at roughly 4 and 8 feet down. Those shoulders were the key. If she could wedge beams across them, she could build a switchback, a cribbed landing halfway down, cross-planked with rough boards, creating a platform where the ramp changed direction. The upper section would descend from the surface to the landing. The lower section would descend from the landing into the sloping throat that led to the cavern floor. She needed lodgepole pine for the beams, long, straight, and strong enough to bear the weight of a panicked ram. She needed rough-cut boards for the platform and ramp surface. She needed iron spikes to pin the joints where lashing would rot in the damp. And she needed all of it before the ground froze hard enough to make hauling impossible. The first tree she felled was a lodgepole on the creek slope below the claim. It took her 2 hours with a hand axe and a borrowed bucksaw. The tree was 30 feet tall and 6 inches at the base. She limbed it where it fell, cut it into 3 10-foot sections, and dragged each one uphill using the mule and a rope harness. By the time the 3rd section reached the sinkhole, her hands were raw and the light was failing. She had moved 3 beams. She needed at least 12. Owen watched from the cabin. Nell helped coil rope. A wind came up from the northwest at sunset, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The water pail outside the cabin froze solid by midnight. Inside, the stove burned through its ration of wood, and the cabin temperature settled at 34 degrees, cold enough to see breath by lantern light. Miriam put both quilts on the children and lay beside them without covering. Below them, in the cavern, she could not yet reach easily and had not yet made safe. The air held at 78 degrees, and the spring pool steamed in the dark. The next morning, she found frost on Owen's blanket where his breath had frozen during the night. His cough, which had been quiet for 2 days, returned with a sound like tearing cloth. She had 20 days of wood. She had a cavern full of warm air 11 feet below a sinkhole no one believed in. And between those 2 facts, between the dying cold of the surface and the hidden warmth of the earth, she had to build a ramp that could carry children, sheep, supplies, and everything she could not afford to lose. Miriam cut the next tree at first light. The axe bit into frozen wood and sent chips flying that stung her face. The clock did not care about her hands. The clock did not care about her plan. The clock only counted down. The ramp took shape in stages, each one slower and harder than the last. The first stage was the upper frame. 2 lodgepole beams wedged across the rock shoulders at the 4-foot mark, braced with shorter cross pieces and lashed with rope until Miriam could drive spikes. She worked inside the chimney by lantern light, suspended on the rope ladder. swinging the hammer in a space so narrow that every backswing scraped knuckle against stone. The rock was basalt, dense and unforgiving. She could not drill into it. She could only find natural ledges and cracks where the beams could seat, then shim them tight with wooden wedges cut from scrub oak and driven with a mallet until the frame held under her full weight. It held. Barely. The beams flexed when she stood on the cross pieces, and one wedge shot free and fell into the dark below with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. She replaced it with a thicker wedge, drove it deeper, and tested again. This time, nothing moved. The second stage was the landing platform, a cribbed shelf at the 8-foot mark where the ramp would change direction. The rock shoulders here were wider, which gave her more surface to build on, but the angle was wrong. The shoulders sloped outward, which meant anything placed on them would slide toward the center of the shaft unless it was pinned or weighted. Miriam solved this by cutting notches into the beam ends with the auger bits, fitting them over the rock lips and driving spikes through the notches into the softer stone beneath. Each spike took 40 blows. She counted. By the 4th day of building, her right hand had blistered, torn, and blistered again over the torn skin. She wrapped it with a strip of flour sacking and kept swinging. The blood soaked through the wrapping by midday and dried by evening, and in the morning she peeled the fabric off the wound and wrapped it fresh. Nell asked to help with the hammer. Miriam let her drive the shallow spikes on the platform decking where the angle was manageable, and the miss margin was wide enough that a child's arm could absorb the error. Owen's cough had not worsened, but it had not improved. The cabin was killing him slowly. Every night the stove burned its ration, and the temperature inside settled between 30 and 36 degrees, depending on wind. The gap under the door admitted a draft that found the children's bed no matter how Miriam stuffed it with rags. She moved their bed against the interior wall, as far from the door as 12 feet allowed, and hung one quilt as a curtain between the bed and the stove. It helped. Not enough. On the 6th day, she finished the landing platform and began the lower ramp section, the steep descent from the platform into the sloping throat that led to the cavern. This section had to bear sheep, which meant side rails and a surface rough enough that hooves could grip. She split scrub oak into slats and nailed them crosswise on the plank surface, creating a pattern of ridges that a sheep's cloven hoof could catch. The side rails were lodgepole halves, peeled and lashed to upright posts at 18-inch intervals. A sheep could not jump them, but the space between was wide enough that a panicked animal might wedge its head through and break its own neck if the gap was not blocked. Miriam filled the gaps with woven willow brush, the same technique she had seen used on stock pens in the valley. It took an entire day to weave enough brush to fill the lower ramp rails. By the end of the first week of building, she had used 11 of her 16 spikes. She had broken the handle of the hand axe and replaced it with a green branch that would split within days. She had eaten through a quarter of the cornmeal and most of the potatoes. The wood pile was down to half a cord. 14 days of heat if she kept the stove low enough that the cabin never rose above freezing. Marit Brecka found Miriam by accident, or by the kind of attention that looks like accident from the outside. Miriam had burned her left hand on the spring pool. She had been testing the water temperature at the source, trying to determine how far from the basin the water had to travel before it cooled enough to UZ. And she had misjudged the gradient. The water at the source was hot enough to scald. Her palm turned white, then red, and the blisters rose before she had climbed back to the surface. She wrapped it in a wet rag and walked to the bathhouse settlement near Glenwood to find someone who knew burns. Marit Brecka was the woman they sent her to. 58, Norwegian-born, wide-hipped and square-shouldered, with hands that had spent 30 years in hot water, first in the laundries of Christiania, then in the washrooms of the immigrant ships, then in the bathhouse settlements of Colorado, where hot springs meant clean linen and steady work. She was a laundress by employment and a midwife by reputation, having delivered 11 babies in Garfield County without losing a mother, though she had lost 2 infants and carried those losses in the lines around her mouth. Marit dressed the burn with lard and clean cloth and asked how it happened. Miriam described the water, the temperature, the color, the mineral smell, the way it cooled across rock. Marit's hands paused on the bandage. "You are describing a spring," Marit said. "Where?" "On my claim." "The upper bench? The rock claim no one filed on?" "Yes." Marit finished the bandage in silence. Then she said, "How hot at the source?" "I could not hold my hand in it for 2 seconds," Miriam said. "And the air in the cave?" Miriam had not mentioned a cave, but Marit had worked in the vapor caves near the bathhouse, natural geothermal chambers where hot springs heated the air to temperatures that loosened joints and opened lungs. She understood that warm springs meant warm cavities, and warm cavities meant spaces that could be used or misused depending on whether the person inside understood ventilation, temperature gradients, and the difference between air that heals and air that kills. "The air holds near 80 degrees on the ledge," Miriam said. "It moves. The flame stays clean." "At what height?" The question stopped Miriam. She had tested the candle at standing height and at the floor of the ledge. She had not tested it in the low pockets between the ledge and the pool, where warm, damp air might displace oxygen and sit like an invisible lake. "I tested at 5 feet and at floor level on the ledge," Miriam said, "not lower." "Then you have not tested where a child would crawl," Marit said, "or where a lamb would lie." She came to the cave the next day. She did not ask permission. She arrived on the claim with a cloth bag containing candle stubs, a ball of twine, a small brass thermometer, and a jar of rendered tallow, and she stood at the sinkhole entrance and looked at the warm air rising through the brush screen and said, "Show me." Miriam showed her. They descended together on the rope ladder, Marit moving with a certainty that suggested she had been in underground spaces before and knew what to trust and what to fear. At the bottom of the throat, where the cavern opened wide, Marit stopped and held up a candle stub at knee height. The flame burned clean. She moved it lower to 6 inches above the stone floor. Clean. She walked toward the warm pool, holding the candle at every height: waist, knee, ankle, floor. Near the pool's edge, at floor level, the flame leaned hard toward the water and guttered. "There," Marit said. "The lowest 6 inches near the source. The warm water drives the oxygen up and the heavy air sits. A grown woman standing would never notice. A child sleeping on the ground would wake with a headache, and the next night would not wake at all." She was not lecturing. She was demonstrating. Her hands moved the candle with the same economy she used dressing a burn. Precise, unhurried, each action explaining itself. Over the next 4 days, Marit returned 3 times. Each visit taught something specific, always through action, never through lecture. The first lesson was timber. Miriam had lashed her ramp beams with rope, which was already softening in the damp air. Marit showed her why. Mineral-rich moisture weakened fiber faster than plain water. "Do not nail load-bearing posts into damp wood," Marit said. "Wedge green poles against rock and keep their feet on stone pads above seep water. The weight of the pole holds it. The stone keeps it dry. The rock does not rot." She and Miriam refooted the ramp's lower beams that afternoon, chipping flat seats into the rock floor with a cold chisel and seating the beam ends on stone pads. It took 3 hours. The beams stopped flexing. The second lesson was drainage. The cavern floor was not uniformly dry. Condensation from the warm pool collected in low places and seeped toward the ledge where Miriam planned to sleep the family. Marit showed her how to cut shallow channels, 3 inches wide, 2 inches deep, using the cold chisel and a handpick lined with flat stones pressed into wet clay. The channels would carry condensation from the sleeping area toward the pool basin, keeping the ledge dry enough for bedding. The work was brutal on the knees. Miriam's trousers wore through at both caps in a single afternoon. The third lesson was sleeping height. 18 inches, Marit said. The platform must be 18 inches above the floor at minimum. Damp air's heavy. It pools at the lowest surface. 18 inches gives you a margin. If I could, I would say 24, but you do not have the timber for 24. 18 will hold if the drains keep working. Miriam built the sleeping platform from lodgepole rounds and split planks, raising it to exactly 18 inches. She checked the measurement 3 times. Owen would sleep on this platform. Nell would sleep on this platform. The margin was not generous. It was the margin she could build with what she had. Marit did not call herself a teacher. She did not offer charity. What she offered was the response of a competent person recognizing competence in another way, the willingness to share what she knew because Miriam was capable of using it correctly. The relationship was not rescue. It was partnership between unequal experience and mutual respect. Marit had the years and the specific knowledge of damp, mineral water, and the behavior of timber and geothermal air. Miriam had the mine air education, the physical stamina, the reason to take the risk, and the intelligence to apply what Marit taught to conditions Marit had not faced. They disagreed once during these days. Miriam wanted to seal the entrance more tightly against cold drafts. Marit refused. "You are not saving heat," she said. "You are saving breath. Close the entrance, and you turn this cavern into a coffin. The draft is your life. You feel cold at the entrance because that is where the cold air feeds in and falls to the floor and pushes the warm air up and out through the vent. Stop that cycle, and the warm air pools, the oxygen thins, and the candle dies. Then you die. Do not seal what breathes." Miriam opened the entrance baffle 6 inches wider than she had planned. The draft increased. The temperature near the entrance dropped 5 degrees. The temperature on the sleeping ledge held at 74. The candle burned clean at every height. Setbacks arrived as steadily as the cold. On the 12th day of building, a plank on the ramp's upper section cracked under the ram's weight. The animal had followed the ewes down the rope ladder path, not the ramp, which was still incomplete, and landed hard on a board that Miriam had thought was sound. The plank split lengthwise, and the ram's hind leg punched through to the knee. Miriam pulled him free, but the leg was scraped to raw flesh, and the ram limped for 3 days. She replaced the plank with a double layer and added a cross brace beneath, which cost her 2 more spikes. She now had 3 spikes left and no money for more. On the 14th day, a storm took part of the cabin roof. Not a blizzard, a wind event that tore 2 planks loose from the south side and sent them spinning into the sage. The gap admitted snow, which melted on the stove and hissed on the hot plate. Miriam nailed the planks back with borrowed nails and stuffed the seams with rags. The repair would not survive another hard wind. On the 16th day, Owen's cough worsened again. The cabin's cold was no longer an inconvenience. It was an active threat. The boy wheezed at night, each breath audible from across the room, and in the morning his lips had the blue tint that means the blood is not carrying what it should. Miriam moved him to the cavern ledge for 2 nights, carrying him down the ramp on her back because the ramp was not yet fitted with side rails, and she would not risk him walking. On the ledge, wrapped in a quilt on the raised platform, his breathing eased within hours. The warm, humid air opened what the cold, dry cabin had closed. She brought him back to the surface each morning because the cavern was not finished. The lower pool area was still unfenced. The ramp rails were still incomplete. A child wandering at night could fall into scalding water or stumble into the low air pocket near the pool's edge. The cave was warm, but it was not yet safe. Fane tightened the economic noose on the 18th day. Miriam went to the store for nails. She needed at least 2 pounds to finish the ramp rails and the sheep pen, and Fane refused to extend more credit unless she signed a new lien against the livestock. The document was already written, lying on the counter as though it had appeared by coincidence. It gave Fane a claim on the sheep and the goat if the debt note plus accrued extensions were not paid by March 1st. Miriam read it twice. The language was simple enough. Failure to repay by the date specified entitled the creditor to seize livestock and improvements on the claim. Improvements. That word covered the ramp, the platforms, and anything else she built below ground. She did not sign. She left the store without nails. That evening, Louisa appeared at the cabin carrying a sack of turnips and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside the cloth were 14 iron nails, half of them bent from previous use. Dill left these in the shed before he went to cut ties, Louisa said. I will not need them until spring, and by spring either you will be alive to return them or you will not, and either way I will not miss them. She set the turnips on the shelf and looked at Miriam. This does not mean I believe in your hole. I know, Miriam said. I think you're probably going to die in it. I know that too. Louisa left. Miriam straightened the bent nails by lantern light, one at a time, tapping them against the stoveplate with the flat of the axe head. 14 nails. She needed 40. But 14 was 14 more than 0. Anson Peel returned on a November afternoon when the sky was the color of a bruise and the air tasted of metal, which in this country meant snow within hours. He did not come to the cabin. He came to the sinkhole. Someone had told him, perhaps Wesley, the boy who watched everything, and Peel had ridden up to see for himself what the widow was building in a hole in the ground. Miriam was below, hammering the last of Louisa's nails into a willow brush panel for the sheep pen. She heard the horse above and climbed the ramp to the entrance. Peel stood at the rim, looking down into the warm dark, where his breath mixed with the rising steam, and disappeared. Mrs. Voss, he said, I told you this was a grave. Miriam did not argue. She pulled the brass thermometer Marit had given her from her coat pocket, tied it to a length of twine, and lowered it into the shaft. She held it at the ledge level for 2 minutes, then drew it back up. Peel looked at the reading. 76 degrees. He looked at the surface, where the frost had killed the last of the sage flowers, and the wind was stripping the last brown leaves from the scrub oak. The surface temperature was 19 degrees. He looked at the thermometer again. Air? He asked. Moving. The flame holds clean. Marit Breke has tested it. Marit Breke is a laundress. Marit Breke has worked in vapor caves for 12 years and has not killed anyone yet. Peel did not smile. He did not concede. But he looked at the thermometer a third time before handing it back, and when he mounted his horse, he did not repeat the word grave. He said, If the rock shifts in a freeze, you will not hear it until it is on you. Then he rode out. He had not been won over, but Miriam had made him look twice, and a man who looks twice is a man who might look a third time when it matters. By late December of 1886, the first version of the shelter was complete. The cavern had 3 working zones. The family platform occupied the eastern ledge, raised 18 inches above the floor, planked with split lodgepole, and covered with the 2 quilts and a layer of dry grass Nell had carried down in armfuls over 6 days. The sleeping area sat where the air was driest, and the draft from the entrance kept a steady flow of fresh cold air beneath the warm layer above. The candle test at platform height showed a clean flame every time Miriam checked, which was twice a day, morning and evening without exception. The sheep ledge occupied the western wall, fenced with willow hurdles lashed to lodgepole posts driven into cracks in the stone floor. The pen was large enough for the full flock, 11 ewes, 1 ram, saki, with space to lie down, but not enough room for a panicked run. The hurdles were tall enough that no sheep could jump them and tight enough that no lamb could squeeze through. Hay was stored in a rock alcove above the seep level, kept dry by the same drainage channels that protected the sleeping platform. The warm waterwork area occupied the center and southern end of the cavern, around the spring pool. Miriam had fenced the pool with a low rail, not to keep adults out, but to prevent a child or an animal from stumbling into water that could scald. The water at the source remained too hot for contact, but Marit had shown her how to channel it through a shallow stone runnel into a side basin where it cooled to a usable temperature, warm enough to wash, to clean wounds, to thaw frozen cloth, but not hot enough to burn. Quilts hung as baffles at the entrance throat, angled to slow the draft without stopping it. The ramp descended in 2 sections, switching direction at the landing platform. The side rails held. The cross-slat surface gave hooves and boots enough grip to descend safely in the dark. A rope ran along the inner wall as a handhold. 2 lantern hooks were set into the rock at the landing and at the cavern floor. So light was available without carrying a flame down the ramp. Early measurements confirmed what Miriam and Marit had predicted. On nights when the surface temperature fell below 0, the cabin water pail froze 2 inches thick. On those same nights, the cavern ledge held between 72 and 80 degrees, varying with wind direction above the vent. The side basin stayed liquid. The hay stayed dry. The sheep settled on the western ledge without being forced, lying down on stone worn smooth by their own weeks of voluntary occupation. But 2 ewes showed signs of early lambing. Their udders had dropped and their bellies hung low and tight, and Miriam calculated they would deliver within weeks, far ahead of the normal March schedule, possibly triggered by the stress of relocation or the warmth of the cavern confusing their seasonal clocks. Newborn lambs would die in the surface cabin if the stove failed. They would die on the open range in minutes. The cavern was the only chance, but lambing required clean bedding, warm water, and space to separate the mothers from the flock. Miriam did not have a lambing pen. She needed to build one before the ewes dropped. Louisa came to look. She descended the ramp holding Miriam's arm, her toddler left with a neighbor, and she stood on the family platform and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The air moves." "I told you it moved," Miriam said. "Telling and feeling are different." Louisa touched the stone wall. Her hand came away warm and damp. "I still worry about fever, damp air, and children, but I was wrong about the lungs. You have made the air move." Louisa's concession was partial and cautious and honest, which made it worth more than enthusiasm. She did not say the cave was safe. She said one specific objection had been answered. The others remained. Anson Peel did not visit again, but word reached Miriam that he had told a neighbor, "The Voss woman has warmth down there. Whether she has sense is another question." Fane was the one who escalated. In the 3rd week of December, he arrived at the claim with a county deputy named Tolliver and claimed that the sinkhole was an attractive nuisance endangering children. Fane had prepared the language in advance. Miriam could hear it in the way he recited the words, as though reading from a document he had written and memorized. He wanted the deputy to inspect the site, declare it unsafe, and order Miriam to seal the entrance. Tolliver was a tired man with mud on his boots and no particular interest in sinkholes. He looked at the entrance, asked if anyone had been injured, and asked if the children had access without supervision. Miriam said the children did not enter without her present, which was true, and that the ramp was built with rails and tested with weight, which was also true. Tolliver wrote something in a notebook and told Fane he could not condemn a homestead improvement without evidence of neglect or injury. Fane stood at the rim and stared down. Steam was rising through the brush screen. The damp warmth beaded on his coat collar. He looked at Miriam, and Miriam saw in his face the thing she had feared more than the cold. He understood. Not the method, not the construction, but the value. He saw warm water rising from a claim he had given away for a $47 debt note, and he understood that he had traded a valley lease for something potentially worth far more. "This is not finished, Mrs. Voss," Fane said. He was right. It was not finished. But the threat had changed shape. The cave was no longer just shelter. It was property worth taking. The hard winter arrived in January of 1887, and it arrived the way the worst things arrive, in layers, each one sealing the escape from the one before. The first layer was dry snow. It came sideways on a northwest wind that did not stop for 36 hours, piling drifts against every surface that faced southeast and stripping the windward slopes to bare frozen grass. The snow was not deep, 18 inches on level ground, but it was cold. The air behind it carried a stillness that veterans recognized. Anson Peel later told a neighbor that when the wind stopped, he knew the worst was coming because silence after a blow means the cold has settled in and means to stay. The second layer was thaw. 2 days after the snow stopped, the temperature rose above freezing for an afternoon, just long enough to melt the surface of the drifts, just long enough to soak the snow down to the grass, just long enough to create hope. Then the temperature fell 40 degrees in 6 hours, and everything that had melted turned to ice. The range glazed over. Grass that had been accessible beneath powder snow was now sealed under a crust thick enough to support a man's weight. Cattle could not paw through it. Sheep could not nose through it. Every blade of forage on the open range became unreachable overnight. The third layer was the killing cold. It came without wind, which made it worse. Wind at least warned. Stillness and cold together meant the air itself had become the enemy. Miriam's cabin thermometer, hung on the exterior wall, read 22 degrees below zero at dawn. By midday, it had risen to 4 below. By the following dawn, it was back to 20 below, and the nails in the cabin walls popped with sounds like pistol shots as the wood contracted around the iron. Across the range, the great die-up was beginning. Cattle that had been left on open range through summer and autumn, thousands of them, tens of thousands across the territories, stood ice-rimmed in draws and creek bottoms, unable to graze, unable to drift to shelter, dying on their feet. Ranchers who had trusted open range and mild winters to do the work of hay and barns discovered that nature does not negotiate. The old system turned them loose, let them forage, gather what survives in spring, broke in the span of weeks. Cowboys found cattle frozen upright against fence lines, their hides crusted with ice, their eyes open. This was the winter that Miriam had built against. This was the test. It came with complications she had not imagined. The first was lambing. The 2 ewes she had been watching dropped within hours of each other on the second night of the killing cold. Miriam was in the cavern when the first ewe lay down and began pushing. The timing was terrible. Weeks early, in the middle of the worst cold snap the territory had seen in years. Lambing required light, warm water, clean hands, and space. Miriam had all of these in the cavern, and none of them on the surface. She penned the laboring ewes in the alcove she had prepared, separated from the flock by a willow hurdle, and delivered 2 lambs by lantern light while Owen slept on the platform and Nell held the lamp. The lambs were small and wet and alive. Miriam dried them with a flour sack and set them against their mothers in clean straw. The cavern air held at 74 degrees. On the surface, The temperature was 21 below. The second complication was Owen. His cough had quieted during the weeks on the cavern ledge, but on the third morning of the cold snap, he woke before Miriam, climbed the ramp alone, and went outside to retrieve a quilt that had blown from the cabin line during the first snow. He was outside for less than 10 minutes. When Miriam found him, he was sitting against the cabin wall with the quilt in his lap, shivering so hard his teeth sounded like stones in a cup. By evening, his cough had returned with a depth that frightened her. She carried him back underground and set him on the platform near the warmest part of the ledge, with Nell beside him and the quilt tucked against the stone wall to trap the rising heat. The third complication was structural. Ice had formed under one of the ramp's upper support beams during the thaw-freeze cycle. The expansion cracked the stone pad Marit had helped her set, and the beam shifted 2 inches outward. The entire upper ramp section tilted. The tilt was subtle. Miriam felt it in her knees before she saw it with her eyes. But under the weight of 11 sheep descending at once, 2 inches of shift would become 6, and 6 would become collapse. She could not fix it from above. The ice had to be chipped out from below, the beam receded, and a new wedge driven into the gap. She did this work in the dark, lying on her back on the landing platform with a cold chisel in one hand and a hammer in the other, chipping ice from stone while the sheep milled above her on the surface and the wind screamed through the entrance. Nell fed the stove in the cabin above to keep it from cracking in the cold. Miriam told her to stay inside, to keep Owen warm, to not come down until called. She worked alone for 2 hours. The ice came away in shards that fell on her face and melted in her eyes. When the beam was reseated and the new wedge driven, she tested it by jumping on the platform 3 times. It held. The fourth complication arrived at dusk on the third day of the killing cold, and it came in a shape Miriam had not planned for. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next choice decides whether the cave becomes shelter or trap. Fane had sent a man. His name was Judd Pell, a hired hand, 30, wiry and weathered, who did the kind of work Fane did not do himself: fence repair, debt collection, property inspection, and the occasional intimidation that fell short of anything a deputy would act on. Fane had sent Pell to the Sinkhole during the storm to confirm what the steam had suggested, that there was warm water below, accessible, potentially valuable, and currently claimed by a woman who owed Fane $50 and had no lawyer. Pell arrived at the Sinkhole rim in the dark, in wind that stripped sensation from exposed skin within minutes. He did not know the entrance was a vertical drop. He did not know the brush screen concealed a shaft. He stepped through the chokecherry and fell. He did not fall the full 11 feet. He caught himself on the rock shoulders at the 4-foot mark, one arm hooked over an outcrop, his body dangling in the shaft with his boots kicking against the ramp beams below. The impact cracked a ramp rail and sent a shower of ice and stone chips down onto the landing platform. He screamed. Miriam heard it from the cavern floor. Through the shaft, through the ramp structure, through the wind, a man's voice, high and broken, echoing down the chimney like something trapped. She told Nell to stay with Owen. She climbed the ramp to the landing platform and looked up. In the lantern light, she could see Pell's boots above her, swinging. One hand gripped the rock. The other arm hung at an angle that meant something was torn or broken. He was not falling, but he was not climbing either. The cold pouring through the entrance was leaching the strength from his grip second by second. The choice was immediate and had no good answer. If she climbed up and pulled him to the surface, they would both be in the wind with nowhere to go. The cabin was 200 yards away, and the cold was lethal in minutes at this temperature with wet clothes and an injured arm. If she pulled him down into the cavern, he would see everything: the warm water, the shelter, the flock, the children, everything she had built and everything Fane wanted. And the ramp, already weakened by the ice shift, would bear the weight of an additional man descending in an uncontrolled slide. She tied a rope around her waist, anchored it to the lower beam of the ramp, climbed to the landing, and reached up into the shaft. "Give me your hand," she said. Pell looked down at her. His face was white. His lips were the color of raw meat. "I cannot let go," he said. "You will let go whether you choose to or not. Your fingers are freezing. Give me your hand and come down." Pell let go. His weight hit the landing platform, and the board screamed against the beams. Miriam caught his coat and pulled him sideways, away from the open shaft, onto the platform. The ramp flexed. One nail pulled free from a cross slat, and the plank swung loose. But nothing collapsed. She guided him down the lower ramp one step at a time, his injured arm held against his chest, his good hand gripping the rope rail. At the cavern floor, the warm air hit him like a wall. He stopped walking and stood in the amber light of the lantern, looking at the sheep on their ledge, the children on the platform, the steam rising from the pool, the quilts hanging as baffles, the entire underground world that Miriam Voss had built while the town called her mad. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Fane told me there was nothing down here but a hole." "Fane tells people what serves Fane," Miriam said. "Sit down before you fall down." She sat him on the family platform, away from the children, and looked at his arm. The shoulder was dislocated, not broken. She had seen dislocations in the coal patch when men fell in shafts. She told him it would hurt more going back in than it had coming out, braced his arm against her knee, and pulled. The joint seeded with a sound like a boot pulled from mud. Pell screamed again, shorter this time, and then he was breathing hard and staring at the warm water steaming in the basin. Outside, the wind kept trying to find a way in. The night passed in hours that felt like seasons. Miriam did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the family platform with Nell curled against her left side and Owen wheezing softly against her right, and she watched the cavern do what she had built it to do. The side basin gave warm water when every surface bucket above was ice. She used it to soak a cloth for Owen's chest, pressing the warmth against his ribs until his breathing eased. The sheep on their ledge chewed cud and breathed steadily, their wool damp with condensation but their bodies warm. The two new lambs nursed. The ewes did not stamp or press the hurdles. The air moved. The candle test held. Miriam checked it 3 times during the night, on the family platform, at the ramp base, and near the pool's edge at knee height. The flame held steady on the platform. It weakened slightly at the pool's edge at floor level, as Marit had predicted, and Miriam moved Louisa's Louisa arrived near midnight. The 5th complication, the one Miriam had not imagined because she had imagined only her own survival. Louisa Hockett came through the storm carrying her toddler against her chest, her coat glazed with ice and her face the color of tallow. Her cabin roof had failed. Not the whole roof, one section, where the sod had dried and cracked during autumn and the snow had piled beyond the weight the rafters could hold. The section collapsed onto the stovepipe, knocking it loose, filling the cabin with smoke and snow simultaneously. Louisa had grabbed the child and walked. The Voss claim was closer than Glenwood. Miriam heard her calling from the surface and climbed to the entrance. Louisa stood in the wind holding the toddler, and Miriam could see that the child was limp and the mother was shaking beyond what cold alone explains. She brought them down. The toddler's lips were blue. Miriam sat Louisa on the platform and unwrapped the child near the warm basin, checking for frostbite on the fingers and toes. The fingers were white, but not hard. The toes were pink enough. Louisa's practical skeptic composure had broken. She held the child and wept without sound, and the cavern held them both. Now the shelter held sheep, children, a hired saboteur with a bad shoulder, a neighbor's family, 2 new lambs, and warm water steaming in the dark. The air still moved. The flames still held. The drain still carried the condensation away. Every system Miriam had built, every lesson Marit had taught, every nail Louisa had donated, every night of labor that the town had mocked, all of it was now holding against the worst night this territory had produced in decades. Miriam placed Louisa's toddler on the platform at the highest point, where the air was driest and the candle flame burned strongest. She moved Owen slightly lower, where the warmth was greater. She adjusted the quilt baffle at the entrance. 6 inches tighter on one side, leaving the gap Marit had insisted on. Judd Pell sat on the stone floor near the sheep pen and watched everything. He said nothing. His face had the expression of a man revising something he had been told. On the surface, the world was dying. Anson Peel's cattle stood ice-rimmed in a draw a mile south, their breath frozen in their nostrils, their hides stiffening. A neighbor's well had frozen 4 feet deep and had to be chopped open with axes. A man 2 claims west got lost between his barn and his house, 20 yards of ground made invisible by blowing snow, and was found at dawn sitting against a fence post, alive but with both feet blackened to the ankles. The range was littered with the shapes of cattle that had drifted against fence lines and stopped. Below ground, the thermometer on the cavern wall read 76 degrees. The spring pool steamed. The lambs nursed. Owen breathed. Morning came as a change in the quality of silence. The wind did not stop, but it shifted, and the light that filtered down through the entrance shaft changed from black to gray to a blue so pale it looked like something the rock itself was producing. Miriam climbed the ramp and pushed through the brush screen. The world above was white and blue and utterly still. The cabin door was buried to the handle in drifted snow. The stovepipe jutted from the drift like a finger pointing at nothing. The goat, which Miriam had left tied to the juniper post because it would not descend the ramp, was alive, pressed against the cabin wall in a pocket of drifted snow that had insulated it by accident. She dug the cabin door open and went inside. The stove was dead. The water pail was frozen solid. The temperature inside was 9 degrees. If the children had been sleeping here, they would not have been sleeping. They would have been dying. She went back down. On the family platform, Marit's brass thermometer held at 76 degrees. Nell was heating water in the copper kettle, held over the side basin where the spring water warmed it without fire. Louisa's toddler was awake and crying, which was the most beautiful sound Miriam had heard since the storm began, because crying requires breath, and breath requires living. Judd Pell looked at Miriam when she descended. His arm was in a sling made from a flour sack. His face was no longer white. The color of his skin matched the color of the living. "The cabin is frozen," Miriam said to no one in particular. "The stove is out. The goat survived by luck." Pell looked at the sheep. He looked at the children. He looked at the warm water steaming in the basin. Then he looked at Miriam. "Fane told me you were crazy," Pell said. Miriam did not answer. She checked the candle at the pool's edge, where the flame guttered slightly. She adjusted the quilt baffle. She made sure Owen was warm. Above them, the wind kept searching for a way in. The storm held for 2 more days before it broke, and when it broke, the silence that followed was louder than the wind had been. Miriam emerged on the 3rd morning to a range that looked like a body under a white sheet. Every fence post wore a cap of ice. Every draw held drifted snow 10 feet deep in the lee corners. The cabin roof had not collapsed, but the snow load had bowed the center planks inward until they touched the stovepipe. If the stove had been burning, the contact would have started a fire. Since the stove had been dead for 3 days, the contact was merely a measurement of how close everything had come to something worse. She dug the goat out. It was angry and alive. She tied it near the entrance and brought it water from the side basin, cooled in the copper kettle to a temperature the animal could drink without scalding. Then she went back down and began the work of returning the surface world to something habitable. Anson Peel rode up before noon. He came expecting what the storm usually delivered to people on exposed claims, with half-finished cabins and insufficient wood, bodies, or the silence that precedes finding them. He had checked 3 other homesteads already that morning and found 2 families alive and 1 cabin empty, the occupants having walked to Glenwood before the worst of the cold set in. The Voss claim was the one he expected to find worst, because the Voss claim had the least to survive with. He dismounted at the cabin and saw the buried door and the bowed roof and the dead stove pipe, and no tracks in the snow except the ones Miriam had made that morning. He stood for a moment in the kind of stillness that comes before a man opens a door he does not want to open. Then he heard sheep bells, underground. He followed the sound to the sinkhole. The brush screen was frosted but intact. Steam rose from the entrance in a column that caught the low sun and turned gold before it dissolved. Miriam was climbing the ramp with a bucket of warm water in one hand and the brass thermometer in the other. She saw Peel and stopped at the rim. She did not speak first. She did not need to. Peel looked at her. He looked at the steam. He looked at the bucket of water that was not frozen and the thermometer that read 76 degrees. Then he looked past her, down the shaft, where lantern light glowed amber on stone, and the sound of sheep moving on rock rose like something from a place that should not exist in January. "How many?" he asked. "All of them. 11 ewes, the ram, 2 lambs born during the storm, both children, Louisa Hockett and her boy, and Judd Pell." "Pell?" Peel's voice changed. "Fane's man? He fell in during the storm. I pulled him down instead of up. His shoulder was out. It is back now." Peel was quiet for what felt like a long time. The steam rose between them. A sheep bell sounded below, muffled and clear at the same time, like something remembered from a dream. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I called this a grave. I was wrong." He said it plainly, without ornament and without softening. It was the admission of a man who had measured the world one way for 62 years and had just been shown a measurement he had missed. He did not apologize. He did not explain his earlier dismissal. He simply acknowledged the new fact, the way a surveyor acknowledges a revised boundary. The line was here. It is now here, and the map must be redrawn. Miriam nodded. She did not need more than that. Peel asked to go down. She led him. He descended the ramp slowly, his hands on the rope rail, his boots testing each cross slat. At the cavern floor, he stopped and looked at the space the way a man looks at a building he did not believe existed until he stood inside it. The sheep on their ledge, the family platform, the quilts as baffles, the side basin steaming, the drainage channels cut into the stone floor. Owen sleeping on the raised platform with Nell beside him, both warm, both breathing. Judd Pell sat near the sheep pen with his arm in the flour sack sling, drinking warm water from a tin cup. He looked at Peel and said nothing. His silence said everything Miriam needed anyone to hear. Fane's man had been sent to spy and had been saved instead. Peel climbed back to the surface without speaking again until he reached his horse. Then he turned and said, "I will tell people." "Tell them what?" Miriam asked. "That the grave is warmer than my house, that the Voss sheep are alive, that 2 lambs were born underground in a blizzard, and both are nursing, and that Louisa Hockett's boy did not freeze because a woman built a ramp into the earth and made it hold. He rode out. Miriam watched him go and felt something shift in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel during the building, during the storm, during the nights of counting and measuring and checking the candle flame. She did not name it. She went back down and checked the vent. Word spread the way it spreads in small settlements, not through announcement but through accumulation. Peel told one neighbor who told another who mentioned it at the store, where Fane heard it and said nothing but wrote something in his ledger. By the end of the week, 3 people had come to the sinkhole entrance and asked to see. Miriam let them look. She did not let them enter unsupervised. The rules she had established during construction became the rules she enforced for visitors. 1 lantern at a time below, no digging or prying at the walls without shoring, no child near the lower pool without an adult at arm's length, no animal forced down the ramp, no blocking the vent for warmth. The rules were not negotiable. The cave was warm, but warmth without discipline was a different kind of danger. The first person who came seeking knowledge rather than spectacle was a ranch wife named Cora Eads, whose root cellar had frozen solid during the storm, and whose winter stores, guais, potatoes, turnips, onions, 2 crocks of sauerkraut, were ruined. She did not want to live in a cave. She wanted to know how Miriam kept the temperature stable underground when her own cellar, dug into the same hillside not 2 miles away, had become a block of ice. Miriam walked her through the logic. The cellar froze because it had no heat source and no ventilation. It was a sealed box buried in cold ground. The cavern stayed warm because the spring heated the air and the vent allowed circulation. Cold air fed in at the bottom, warm air rose and exited at the top, and the cycle kept the temperature stable and the air breathable. Without the spring, the cave would freeze too. But the principle that moving air and a heat source, even a modest one, could maintain a livable temperature, applied to any underground space, including a root cellar with a small stovepipe vented to the surface and a low intake gap at the door. Cora Eads listened, asked 2 questions about pipe diameter, and left. By spring, her rebuilt cellar had a vent pipe and a low gap and did not freeze again. A sheepman named Greer, the same man Peel had suggested Miriam's cellar used to, came to look at the willow hurdles. He had lost 30 sheep in the storm, penned in a draw with no windbreak and no overhead cover. The sheep had piled against each other, and the ones on the outside froze, while the ones in the center suffocated. Greer did not apologize for having once offered $3 a head for animals he now understood were worth more alive in Miriam's care than dead in his. He looked at the hurdles, asked about the lashing technique, and left. A bathhouse worker from the Glenwood settlement came to ask about the entrance baffle, how the quilts were angled, how wide the gap was left, whether canvas worked better than cloth. Miriam showed him. He took notes on the back of a laundry receipt. Each visitor carried away a piece of the method, and each piece was specific: a vent diameter, a platform height, a drainage angle, a baffle gap. Miriam shared freely because the method was not a secret. It was a set of principles that worked only when applied with precision and discipline. Sharing the principles without the discipline was useless. Sharing both required the kind of teaching that took time, patience, and the willingness to say no when someone wanted a shortcut. Louisa Hockett's conversion was the quietest and the most complete. She had arrived at the cave carrying her dying toddler and had left 3 days later carrying a living one. She did not make speeches about being wrong. She came back the following week with a sack of dried apples and asked Miriam to show her how to test a cellar with a candle. Miriam showed her. Louisa held the candle at knee height, at ankle height, at floor level, and watched the flame. She understood without being told what a guttering flame meant and what a steady flame meant. She had learned it the way Marit had taught it, through demonstration, not explanation. I will not say you were right, Louisa said. I will say the air moves and the children breathe. That is enough. It was enough. More than enough. Marit came less often after the storm. The cold had settled into her joints the way cold settles into timber, slowly, deeply, in places that do not show until weight is applied. She walked to the claim twice in January, each time slower than the last, and on the second visit she sat on the family platform and did not rise for an hour. She said her knees were stiff. Miriam knew it was more than knees, but the visits she made were the richest of their partnership. With the crisis past and the shelter proven, Marit and Miriam turned to the work of refinement, the small improvements that separated survival from habitation. They built a second vent path. Marit had noticed that when wind blew from the southeast, the main vent created a downdraft that pushed cold air directly onto the family platform. The effect was manageable but uncomfortable, and on the coldest nights it dropped the platform temperature by 8 degrees. The solution was a secondary crack, a narrow natural fissure in the upper wall, partially blocked by loose stone, that could be cleared to provide an alternative exhaust route. They worked together for 2 days, chipping stone from the fissure with cold chisels, widening it from 4 inches to 9 inches, and testing the airflow with candle flame at every stage. The result was immediate. With 2 vents drawing warm air upward, the circulation stabilized. The platform temperature held within 3 degrees regardless of wind direction. The candle flame at floor level burned cleaner. The air tasted different. Not better, exactly, but more consistent, like the difference between a room with 1 window and a room with 2. Marit taught one more thing during these visits, and it was not a technique. It was a warning. They were sitting on the platform after finishing the second vent, drinking warm water from tin cups, and Marit said, "You will become a miracle to them." Miriam looked at her. The woman who went underground and lived. The widow who saved sheep in a blizzard. They will tell it larger than it was. They will leave out the drainage and the vent and the candle test and the platform height. They will say you went into a hole and the earth kept you warm, and they will try to do the same without understanding why it worked. Marit set her cup on the stone. Miracles make people careless. Rules keep them alive. Do not let them turn your work into a story. Keep it a method. Miriam heard the instruction beneath the words. Marit was not talking about other people's carelessness. She was talking about the moment when a survivor stops being careful because she has already survived. The moment when success becomes the foundation of the next failure. I will keep the rules, Miriam said. Keep them when they are inconvenient, Marit said. That is the only time they matter. In late February, Marit told Miriam she was leaving. Her nephew in Denver had written to say there was laundry work and a room above a bakery, and the altitude in Glenwood was doing to her lungs what the damp had done to her knees. She would go before the spring thaw made the roads worse. The departure was not dramatic. Marit did not weep. Miriam did not beg her to stay. They were 2 women who had built something together and understood that the building was finished and the builder could leave without the structure falling. Marit gave Miriam the brass thermometer. You are still using it twice a day, she said. It should stay where it works. It should stay with the person who taught me to read it, Miriam said. I taught you to read what you already knew how to see, Marit said. Your father did the rest. I only filled in the parts where coal and hot springs differ. She left on a freight wagon heading south. Miriam stood at the claim's edge and watched until the wagon rounded the bend below the bench. The thermometer was warm in her hand from Marit's grip. She went below, and hung it on the cavern wall, at the height where the family platform met the stone, at the point where the reading mattered most. It was not a shrine, it was a tool, still in use, placed where it would be checked every morning and every evening for as long as Miriam Voss drew breath. 3 weeks later, word came from Denver through a bathhouse worker who had relatives there. Marit Brecka had died of pneumonia. She had been ill for 5 days. She had not sent word because sending word would have brought Miriam down from the mountain, and Marit did not believe in pulling people from the work that kept them alive. Miriam received the news standing at the Sinkhole entrance. She looked down into the warm dark and listened to the sheep bells and the sound of Nell's voice reading to Owen from a borrowed book. The air rose past her face, warm and damp and steady. Every breath of it carried something Marit had shaped: the vent angle, the drainage channel, the platform height, the rule about the candle, the insistence that breath mattered more than heat. She did not cry in front of the children. She went to the lower pool that evening after they were asleep and sat on the stone where Marit had first tested the air with a candle at knee height. The water steamed. The flame held steady. The walls of the cavern were dark and close and warm, and the sound of the spring was the only sound, and it was the sound of the earth refusing to stop giving what it had always given, regardless of who was there to receive it. Spring did not end the danger. It changed the shape. Meltwater was the first new enemy. As the snow above the cavern began to thaw, water found its way through cracks in the rock that had been sealed by ice all winter. The lower cavern floor, which had stayed dry through the cold months, began to seep. Small pools formed in the drainage channels and rose toward the sleeping platform. The hay alcove, which Miriam had kept above seep level, now sat 2 inches above a widening puddle. Miriam applied Merritt's drainage lessons. She cut a spill channel from the pool overflow, a shallow stone-lined trench angled toward a natural gravel swallow in the southeast corner of the cavern where water drained into deeper rock. The work took 3 days with a cold chisel and a hand pick, and by the time she finished, her knees were raw and her back seized when she tried to straighten. But the water followed the channel. The puddle retreated. The hay stayed dry. She raised the sheep platform another foot, adding a second layer of lodgepole rounds beneath the planking. She replaced the rope lashings on the ramp where damp had softened the fiber, swapping them for peg joints that Marit had described, but they had not had time to build during the autumn rush. Each peg was a wedge of green scrub oak driven through a bored hole in the beam joint, tight enough that the wood's own grip held the connection without rope or nail. The ramp was stronger now than it had been during the storm. The drainage was better. The vents drew cleaner. Every improvement was a debt paid to Marit's teaching, applied without Marit's hands. Thomas Ardrey arrived in March. He was a widowed blacksmith and wheelwright from a settlement near Carbondale, 41 years old, with a forge-scarred left hand and a way of looking at broken things that suggested he was already designing the repair. He had heard about the cave from Greer, the sheepman, who had described the willow hurdles and the ramp construction in enough detail that Thomas understood someone had built something worth seeing. He did not come to see the cave. He came to trade. His right hand had been burned in a forge accident, not as badly as Miriam's spring pool scald, but badly enough that gripping a hammer was difficult, and the skin was splitting in the cold, dry air. He had heard that warm water helped burns heal faster than cold, and that the Voss claim had warm water year-round. Miriam let him soak the hand in the side basin twice a day for a week. In exchange, Thomas forged strap hinges for the entrance gate, spike collars for the ramp beam joints, and a safer latch mechanism that could be locked from inside, the first real security the entrance had ever had. He worked at a portable anvil he carried on a mule, heating iron in a small charcoal box, and shaping it with one-handed blows that were slower than a two-handed smith's, but no less precise. He taught Nell to set rivets. The girl watched him work the way her mother watched the candle flame, with a focus that meant she was learning something she would use for the rest of her life. Thomas noticed and did not comment. He simply handed her the rivet set and the backing plate and let her drive the first one herself. It took her 6 blows. The rivet held. Thomas looked at Miriam when Nell finished. "She has your hands," he said. It was the first personal thing he had said in a week of working on the claim. The secondary crisis arrived in late autumn of 1887, and it arrived as illness. A respiratory sickness moved through the settlement, not scarlet fever, which Miriam had feared, but something that sat in the chest and burned and would not leave. 3 families on the lower claims reported children coughing blood. A ranch hand at Greer's operation collapsed while mending fence and could not rise for 2 days. The bathhouse workers in Glenwood closed the public pools because the steam seemed to worsen the coughing, and the loss of income made everyone shorter-tempered and more desperate. People came to Miriam. Not many, 6, then 8, then 11 in the space of 2 weeks. They came because the cave was warm, because warm air eased breathing, because Miriam had kept Owen alive through the worst cough of the winter, and people remembered. They came carrying children and blankets, and the assumption that warmth was enough. Miriam understood that it was not. Marit's warning returned. Miracles make people careless. The cave could warm a sick child's lungs, but it could not prevent contagion. 11 people in a closed space with a respiratory illness would become 11 sick people in a closed space, and the warm, damp air that eased symptoms would also carry whatever was causing them. The cave would become a sick room, and a sick room underground was a death chamber. She made the hardest decision of the autumn. She would not turn people away, but she would not let them crowd together. She created a quarantine arrangement, a roped-off alcove near the entrance, where the air was coolest and the draft strongest, separated from the main cavern by hung sheets boiled in the hot spring and dried on the ramp rails. The sick stayed near the entrance. The healthy stayed on the family platform. The sheep stayed on their ledge. No one crossed the sheets without Miriam's permission. The vent stayed open. Louisa argued for closing it. The draft chilled the sick children near the entrance, and the mothers wanted warmth. Miriam refused. "The draft carries the sickness out," she said. "Close the vent, and the sickness stays in the air and everyone breathes it. The cold at the entrance is the price of clean air in the cavern. You cannot have both." It was Marit's logic applied to a problem Marit had not faced. Ventilation was not comfort. It was survival. The principle did not change because the threat had changed. Fane saw an opportunity. With sick families using the cave, he argued to the county that Miriam was operating an unlicensed public bath and endangering the community by housing ill people underground without medical supervision. The complaint was written in the same careful language as the attractive nuisance claim. Legal enough to require a response, vague enough to suggest danger without specifying it. Thomas Ardrey, who had stayed on the claim through autumn repairing the entrance gate and building a surface windbreak for the goat, helped Miriam respond. He gathered witness statements. Louisa Hockett testified that the cave had saved her toddler during the January storm. Cora Eads testified that Miriam's ventilation advice had saved her rebuilt root cellar. Greer testified that the willow hurdle design had protected his remaining sheep through a second cold snap, and Anson Peel, who had once called the cave a grave, rode to the county seat and told the clerk that Miriam Voss had pulled Judd Pell from a frozen shaft during a blizzard, set his dislocated shoulder, and kept him alive until morning in a shelter that held 76 degrees while the surface held 20 below. "If that is a public nuisance," Peel said, "then every barn in the county is a hazard." The complaint did not proceed, but Fane did not stop. He adjusted, the way a man adjusts who has been denied through the front door and begins looking for windows. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is built before the storm arrives. The sickness passed by early winter. No one died in the cave, though 2 children on lower claims died in their cabins where the air was cold and dry, and the stoves burned too hot, and the windows were sealed against drafts because their parents feared the cold more than they feared what they could not see. Miriam heard about the deaths from Louisa, who told her without commentary because the commentary was obvious. The children who died had been in sealed rooms. The children who lived had been in the cave, where the air moved. Miriam did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The measurements said it. The thermometer on the cavern wall said it. The steady flame of the candle said it. And the small brass instrument Marit Brecka had placed in Miriam's hand said it every morning and every evening, reading 74, 76, 78, holding steady while the world above froze and thawed and froze again. The cave was no longer a secret. It was no longer a scandal. It was becoming what Miriam had built it to be, not a miracle, but a method. And the method was spreading. By the spring of 1888, the operation that people had begun calling Voss Warm Shelter had settled into a rhythm that resembled less a homestead and more a small, disciplined institution governed by rules that Miriam enforced without apology. A typical day began before dawn, when Miriam descended the ramp to check the candle at 3 heights, platform, floor, and pool edge, before anyone else came below. The brass thermometer was read and the number spoken aloud to Nell, who entered it in a ledger that now contained 14 months of daily readings. The temperatures varied by fewer than 10 degrees across an entire year, 72 on the coldest mornings when the vent drew hard and the wind above was fierce, 81 on still summer afternoons when the Earth's heat had no draft to compete with. The consistency was the point. The consistency was what no surface structure in the territory could match. The sheep descended at their own pace. The lead ewe, the same animal that had first found the sinkhole, now 3 years older and carrying her second set of lambs conceived in the warm air below, walked the ramp without guidance. The others followed. By mid-morning, the flock was on the western ledge. The hayrack was filled from the alcove stores, and the water trough, a hollowed pine log fed by a stone channel from the cooled side basin, held liquid water that would not freeze regardless of the surface temperature. The lambing pens had expanded from the single alcove Miriam had built during the first crisis to a row of 3 divided enclosures, each with its own hayrack, water supply, and low willow fence that allowed the ewes to see each other without physical contact. Miriam had learned through 2 seasons that isolated ewes panicked and injured themselves, while ewes within sight of the flock calmed and delivered more easily. The pen design was Marit's logic applied to livestock, separation for safety, visibility for sanity. The warm waterwork area had evolved from an emergency basin into a managed resource. Miriam had built a second stone runnel that carried cooled spring water to a wash station near the entrance, where wool could be cleaned, cloths boiled, and wounds dressed without descending to the pool level. The wash station was the most visited part of the shelter. Neighbors who had never entered the main cavern came to the entrance to fill jugs with warm water during cold snaps, and Miriam let them because the water cost her nothing and the goodwill cost less. Seed-starting shelves lined one section of the eastern wall above the sleeping platform. In February, while the surface ground was still frozen solid, Miriam planted onion sets and cabbage starts in wooden trays filled with creek-bottom soil. The cavern air was warm enough and humid enough that germination happened weeks before it could on the surface, and by the time the last frost passed in May, Miriam had seedlings ready for transplanting that were a full month ahead of anyone else's. The advantage was small in a good year. In a year with a late frost, it was the difference between a harvest and a loss. A drying rack for wool hung near the vent, where the steady draft pulled moisture from fleeces faster than sun drying in the variable mountain air. The wool came off cleaner, too. The mineral content of the cavern air seemed to discourage the insects that infested surface-dried fleeces, though Miriam did not claim to understand why. She noted it in the ledger and let the result speak. None of this was accidental. None of it was miraculous. Every element traced back to a principle: moving air, stable temperature, managed water, measured space. The cavern was not magic. It was infrastructure, built by a woman who understood that the earth offered something, and that taking it responsibly required rules. The rules had not relaxed. No drunken men were allowed below. No mining or blasting within 500 feet of the entrance. No blocked vents, ever, for any reason, under any conditions. No unsupervised children near the lower pool. No open flame below without a candle test at floor level first. No animals forced down the ramp. They descended willingly, or they stayed on the surface. The rules were posted on a board at the entrance, written in Miriam's hand, and anyone who objected to them was welcome to leave. Most did not object. The rules were the reason the shelter worked, and by the second winter even the people who had mocked the sinkhole understood that the rules and the warmth were inseparable. Remove one and the other became dangerous. Fane's final confrontation came in the autumn of 1888, and it arrived wearing an investor's coat. The man's name was Pardee from Denver, a speculator in mineral claims and hot spring properties who had heard through the network of bathhouse operators and land agents that a widow near Glenwood was sitting on a geothermal source with year-round warm water. Fane had written to him. Fane had described the cave in terms that made it sound like a ready-made resort: natural hot spring, enclosed chamber, established infrastructure, year-round access. He had not mentioned the sheep. He had not mentioned the children. He had not mentioned the ramp built with borrowed nails and bent spikes, and the labor of a woman working alone in the dark. Pardee arrived in a hired buggy with Fane beside him, wearing a checked vest and carrying a leather notebook. They came to the claim without warning on a Tuesday afternoon when Miriam was below, adjusting the wash station runnel where a stone had shifted. Nell saw them first. She was on the surface, hanging wool on the drying line, and she went to the entrance and called down, "Mama, Mr. Fane is here with a man in a buggy." Miriam climbed the ramp. She emerged into the autumn light with mineral dust on her sleeves, and her hair tied back with a strip of the same red flannel she had once tied to the lead ewe's neck. She looked at Fane. She looked at Pardee. She did not greet either of them. Fane spoke first. "Mrs. Voss, this is Mr. Pardee from Denver. He's interested in the mineral spring on your claim and has come to assess its commercial potential." "Its commercial potential," Miriam repeated. "Hot springs are valuable property," Fane said. "Glenwood has proven that. A natural warm water source with an enclosed chamber could attract paying visitors year-round. Mr. Pardee has experience developing such properties." Pardee opened his notebook. "I would like to inspect the site, Mrs. Voss. With your permission, of course." "You may inspect from the entrance," Miriam said. "You may not enter without following the safety rules." Fane's mouth thinned. "Mrs. Voss, this is a professional assessment. Mr. Pardee is not a tourist." "The rules are not for tourists," Miriam said. "The rules are for the cave. Anyone who enters follows them. That includes you, Mr. Fane." The rules required a candle test at the entrance, single-file descent, one lantern carried by the guide, which was Miriam, and no deviation from the ramp path without permission. Pardee agreed. Fane agreed with the expression of a man who had expected to walk through an open door and found it latched. They descended. Pardee was methodical and quiet, noting the ramp construction, the platform heights, the water temperature, the air quality. He asked intelligent questions about the flow rate of the spring, the consistency of the temperature, the stability of the rock. Miriam answered precisely because precise answers were the only kind worth giving. Fane was not methodical. Fane was impatient. He wanted Pardee to see value, and value to Fane meant volume. How many people could fit below? How much could be charged? How quickly the infrastructure could be expanded? He walked ahead of Miriam on the cavern floor, moving toward the lower pool where the water was hottest and the air was most impressive, ignoring the ramp path and the lantern rule. "The spring source is here," Fane said, gesturing toward the pool. "You can feel the heat. This is what Glenwood charges $2 a visit for, and this is untapped." "Mr. Fane," Miriam said, "step back to the path." Fane did not step back. He moved closer to the pool, waving Pardee forward. "Come feel the water. This is real. This is worth." The candle in Miriam's hand guttered. She had been carrying it at waist height, as she always did when guiding someone through the cavern. At the pool's edge, where the warm water drove oxygen upward and heavier air settled at floor level, the flame leaned and dimmed. At waist height it held. At knee height it weakened. At the level of a man's head, if he stumbled and fell, it would die. "Mr. Fane," Miriam said, and her voice had the quality of a woman who has said the same thing too many times to say it gently. "You are standing in the low air pocket. The candle shows it. Step back to the path now." Fane looked at the candle. He looked at Miriam. His face carried the expression of a man who believes he is being managed by someone who has no right to manage him. Anson Peel's voice came from the ramp. He had followed them down, uninvited, but Miriam had not stopped him because Peel had earned the right to come and go by the testimony he had given to the county clerk. He stood on the lower ramp, his hand on the rope rail, and he said, "Fane, move." Fane moved, not because Miriam told him to, because Peel told him to, and Peel's voice carried the weight of a man who had seen what the cave could do and what the cave could take. Pardee closed his notebook. He looked at Fane, and then he looked at Miriam, and then he said something that ended the conversation. "Mr. Fane, you describe this property as a commercial opportunity. What I see is a managed shelter operated by a woman who understands the air, the water, and the stone. A man who ignores the candle test in a geothermal cavity is a man who will kill a paying customer within the first season. I will not invest with a partner who does not respect the space." He climbed the ramp. Fane stood in the cavern for a moment, alone in the lantern light, with the candle flame steady now that he had moved back to the path. He looked at the sheep on their ledge, at the sleeping platform, at the brass thermometer on the wall reading 76 degrees, at the entire underground world that he had tried to take and could not. He climbed out without speaking. The debt settled 2 weeks later. Fane did not come to the claim. He sent the terms through the county clerk. The remaining balance of Ace's debt, plus the extensions for rope, spikes, and bits, would be forgiven in exchange for documented rescue testimony, confirming that Judd Pell had been saved from freezing in the cave during the January blizzard, plus a repayment schedule of wool deliveries over 2 years, witnessed by Anson Peel and Louisa Hockett. Miriam signed. The terms were modest, and the witnesses were people Fane could not intimidate. The debt that had hung over her claim since Asa's death was resolved not by money, but by evidence. the evidence that Miriam's cave had saved the life of the very man Fane had sent to undermine it. Fane's final acknowledgement came through Pell, who delivered the signed settlement papers to the claim and stood at the entrance while Miriam read them. "He said to tell you something," Pell said. "Tell me." He said, "You made a poor claim worth more than I knew." Miriam folded the papers. "No," she said. "I learned what it was worth before he did." Pell shifted his weight. His shoulders still ached in cold weather. He told her this as though it were a confession, and he asked if he could soak it in the side basin before riding back. Miriam let him. He descended the ramp with the familiarity of a man who had been pulled into the dark once and never entirely left it. Thomas Ardrey did not court Miriam with words. He courted her with work. He repaired the ramp after the spring meltwater had softened two beam joints. He built a lockable entrance gate from forged iron and lodgepole, hung on the strap hinges he had made the previous autumn, with a latch that could be thrown from inside and a bar that could be dropped from outside. He taught Nell to set rivets and to read the color of heated iron, cherry red for bending, bright orange for welding, white for burning. He taught Owen, whose cough had finally cleared after the second winter underground, to hold a backing plate steady and to count hammer blows so the rhythm stayed even. He did not move on to the claim. He did not ask to. He came 3 days a week from his shop in Carbondale, worked until the light failed or the task was done, and rode back. He brought his own food. He brought tools when tools were needed, and left them when they were not. He repaired things Miriam had not asked him to repair: a cracked ramp rail, a loose vent stone, a worn rope handle on the side basin, and did not mention the repairs until Miriam noticed them. The first time he said something that was not about work, they were sitting on the surface beside the entrance at dusk, watching the steam rise from the sinkhole into air that was just cold enough to make it visible. Nell and Owen were below, and the sound of Nell reading aloud drifted up through the shaft. The girl had acquired 3 books from a teacher in Glenwood and read them to her brother with the seriousness of someone performing a public duty. Thomas said, "She reads the way you build, like she knows the structure matters more than the finish." Miriam looked at him. It was the first time anyone had described her work with a word like structure. Most people said brave or desperate or unusual. Thomas said structure because he was a man who built things and recognized building when he saw it. Her father read to her every night when she was small, Miriam said. He said words were like nails. You could scatter them or you could drive them true. Thomas was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I would like to keep coming here if the work holds out." "The work will hold out," Miriam said. "This place makes more work than it finishes." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his face from cautious to warm in a way that reminded her that warmth was not only a property of the earth. They married in the spring of 1889, after the claim was secure and the debt was settled and Nell had given her opinion, which was that Thomas was acceptable because he let her use the rivet set without hovering. The wedding supper was held partly on the surface, where the evening light turned the sage gold, and partly in the warm entrance chamber, where Louisa had hung wild flowers from the ramp rails and the sheep bells sounded below like something between music and memory. Thomas moved his forge to the claim. He built a surface workshop beside the cabin, which Miriam had repaired, rechinked, and re-roofed, though the family still slept below during the coldest months, and took commission work from the settlement: hinges, gate latches, wheel rims, and the spike collars that had become his signature piece, designed for the kind of beam-to-rock joints that Miriam's ramp had pioneered. The partnership worked because Thomas understood the rules. He did not try to expand the cave into a business. He did not suggest blasting to widen the entrance. He did not bring strangers below without checking with Miriam first. He understood that the shelter belonged to the person who had built it, and that his role was to strengthen what existed, not to replace it with something larger. When a neighbor suggested they charge admission, Thomas said, "You do not charge people to breathe." The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the rhythm is established. Owen apprenticed with Thomas and learned to forge the gate latches and spike collars that kept the underground infrastructure sound. Nell became a teacher at the Glenwood School and kept a weather ledger that recorded surface and cavern temperatures daily for 11 years, the longest continuous geothermal temperature record in the county. The data showed what Miriam had always known. The earth does not change its mind. The spring held its heat. The rock held its shape. The air moved. The flock grew from 11 ewes to 34 by 1892. And the wool, cleaned in warm mineral water, dried on the vent draft rack, and delivered in better condition than any surface processed fleece in the territory, brought premium prices from the mill buyers in Denver. The vegetable starts gave Miriam a market advantage every spring. Onion sets and cabbage seedlings, available 3 weeks before anyone else's, grown in cavern warmth while the ground above was still frozen. Miriam's hands stiffened as she aged. The years of hammering, chiseling, hauling, and gripping rope in damp air thickened her knuckles and shortened her reach. The scar across her right wrist, where the iron spike had torn skin during the first storm, the night she caught the slipping lamb on the ramp, whitened and tightened until it pulled the tendons beneath it and made a fist difficult on cold mornings. She did not complain about it. She adjusted her grip on the chisel and let Thomas handle the heavier hammerwork and checked the candle twice a day and kept the ledger and enforced the rules. The rules did not change. 20 years after the first descent, the sign at the entrance still read, "No blocked vents, no unsupervised children near the pool, no flame without a candle test, no animals forced." Visitors who had been coming for years still followed them. New visitors who thought the rules were excessive were told, once, why they existed. If they argued, they were welcome to leave. Miriam Voss died in 1911 on the claim in the cabin Thomas had rebuilt twice. With the forge cold because Thomas had died 2 years earlier, and Owen had not yet moved the anvil to his own shop. She was 59. The pneumonia that took her was quick, 3 days from the first cough to the last breath, and Nell was beside her, holding the brass thermometer that Marit Breke had given her 25 years before. Miriam's last instruction was not sentimental. She told Nell to check the vent before lighting the lamp. Nell checked it. The flame held steady. By the early 1890s, at least 17 families within a day's ride of the upper bench had adopted some part of Miriam's method. Not all of them had geothermal caves, most did not. But the principles traveled. Raised sleeping platforms in root cellars, vented entrances on stock shelters, wind-baffled doorways on cabins, candle tests in any enclosed space where animals or children slept. A sheepman near Basalt built lambing pens based on Miriam's 3-pen design and did not lose a lamb to cold for 4 consecutive seasons. A ranch wife in Carbondale rebuilt her root cellar with a vent pipe and a low intake gap and kept her winter stores unfrozen through the hardest months. The brass thermometer passed through 6 hands before it came back to Nell, who hung it in the schoolroom in Glenwood and used it to teach children the difference between air that moves and air that kills. Miriam lived out her years on the 160 acres of rock and scrub oak that Carver Fane had given her as a punishment. The claim was never wealthy. It was never a resort. It produced wool, vegetables, warm water, and a community that asked before it laughed. Her later years were marked not by triumph, but by the particular quiet of a life that had answered its own question, and did not need to answer it again. The scar on her wrist whitened. The ledger filled. The thermometer held. In January, when the storms came down from the northwest and the temperature fell to 20 below, and the wind stripped the sage bare and drove snow against every surface that stood upright, the old cabin disappeared under drifts until only the stovepipe showed above the white. Anson Peel, who had stood at the sinkhole rim and called the cave a warm grave, was 10 years dead by then, buried in the Glenwood Cemetery with a stone that said nothing about sheep or shelters or the widow he had underestimated. But below the snow, below the rock, below the frost line and the frozen ground and the silence of the surface, a child's mitten dried on a ramp rail. Sheep breathed in the amber dark. Marit's thermometer read 76 degrees, the same as it had read on the morning after the worst storm in the territory's memory, the same as it would read tomorrow and the morning after that. The spring did not stop. The vent did not close. The air moved. Above them, the wind kept searching for a way in,